Hello, everybody, and welcome to Voice Explores. My name is Professor Lynne Corner. I'm the Director of Voice and the Deputy Director of the UK National Innovation Centre for Ageing, and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, Voice, as many of you may know, but we have some new members joining as well, and you are most welcome. Voice is all about amplifying the needs, the priorities and the aspirations of people on all aspects of healthy ageing, and really ensuring that businesses and researchers can understand what is important to people, to us. And together we can look at kind of businesses, at research, science, innovation, technology to help people to have happier, healthier, longer lives. Now, we know that there is so much science and knowledge around, but often it's actually really hard to know what is trusted information. And we also know that people are incredibly curious and interested in learning more about certain issues. And this is what Voice Explores is all about. It is your opportunity for our members to ask the questions that are of interest to you. We have a pleasure of meeting experts like John today in specific areas for the latest developments and innovations. So this is all about our opportunity to ask questions and really kind of nurture that curiosity. And today we're going to be talking to an expert in nutrition and food. And thanks to so many people who've already contributed their questions. There's going to be a question throughout the session to ask questions through the Q&A, not the chat. It must go through Q&A, so please submit your questions. And I know that we might not be able to get through all of them today, but we will try our best, and we will certainly take all the questions on board, and we'll be able to perhaps include those through future sessions. And also we'll circulate some information at the end on some trusted resources that you can follow up if you're interested. So that's the way it will work. But as I said, we're just delighted today to be joined by a long-standing friend and colleague of mine at Newcastle University and an international expert on food and nutrition, Professor John Mathers. John, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Lynne, thank you very much, and great to be with you. So, as you know, I'm Professor of Human Nutrition here in Newcastle, and over the more than 40 years that I've worked in this university, I've been interested in this link between nutrition and how we age, and trying to tease out what might be beneficial to help us age better and to avoid all those nasty things that tend to happen to people later in life.
Fantastic. And you, as you said, you've spent decades studying nutrition. Perhaps start us off by just saying what's some of the most surprising things that you've learned that maybe goes against popular wisdom?
Okay, so when I started in this university, there was hardly any interest in nutrition among the medical fraternity. The only people who were really interested in nutrition at that stage were the surgeons, because they had some particular patients who needed to be fed through a vein. They couldn't take food through their mouth because of the surgery. And so the professor of surgery at the time had an interest in nutrition, but hardly anybody else has. And one of the things that's really been amazing over those years that I've spent in university is how nutrition now touches every area of health. So it's not just about surgical patients, it's about everything. And that's been the most surprising thing. The recognition that what we eat, how much, and the patterns of what we eat affects our life from the very beginning right to the very end.
It really does. It's that through life, isn't it? And that's something that I know we've got lots and lots of questions on that. And one of the questions that somebody submitted a few weeks ago was kind of, often, as you've said, the solution for many health problems might actually be quite simple. And, is one of the areas that we need to eat less and fast more was one of the questions.
Okay. So it's a great question, especially when we're in Ramadan and Lent, because that's about fasting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come back to the fasting bit. But first of all, a bit about eating a bit less. One of the problems that we have in the UK, and in fact, most parts of the world, is that a lot of people are too heavy.
Yes.
So we've been eating too much and we've not been doing enough exercise.
Yes.
So at one level, it's very simple. A lot of people need to eat less food just so they don't gain too much weight.
Yeah.
And although it seems simple, it can be quite complicated for people to achieve. Yeah. And it's that moving from knowing what you want to do to changing all those behaviors around food that make it difficult to change.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's happened recently in this area is that we've worked more and more with psychologists who understand about human behavior who can help to develop those ways that enable people to make the changes, not just today and tomorrow, but sustain those changes over long term. And that's the difficult bit.
Yeah.
Most of us could eat a bit less for a few days or a few weeks, for a wedding or something like that.
Yeah.
But when it comes to making changes over months and years, that's when it gets tough.
That's the hard bit, isn't it? And I think, again, that's one of the questions that people had, is that a lot of our norms around eating are changing, and people often don't know what to do because there's so much different information out there. I mean, do you eat little and often, or do you eat bigger, substantial meals 2-3 times a day, sort of breakfast, lunch, dinner kind of thing?
Yeah. And that's something where what works for one person may not work for another person.
Yeah.
And I've had these conversations with some of my friends and neighbors, because when they know you're a nutritionist, this is sort of question you get. And they'll come to me and say, well, this works for me.
Yeah.
And I say, that's great.
Yeah.
Somebody else says, this works for me. I think that's also great. So I don't think you need to prescribe how frequently people eat, or the number of meals a day, or whether you have big gaps between meals. I think that's down to personal choice.
Okay.
The important thing is that we don't eat too much.
Yeah.
And that's where I come back to Ramadan and Lent, because they're all about discipline in eating.
Mm-hmm.
So they're both periods in the year for religious communities when people can stand back from all the busyness and think a bit about their lives, and think a little bit about how to get a bit of structure and discipline in their lives. And it's not about, long-term fasting, but it might just be about eating a bit less,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe not eating those things that we love to eat,
Mm-hmm.
but we know we shouldn't eat too much of.
Mm-hmm.
So, people give up chocolate, or they give up alcohol, or those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So I don't mind what it is you do, but I think those religious holidays or those religious fasting periods can just be a time to reflect a little bit and just think, even if you're not a religious person, just think about how we could change our lives.
Yeah, and I say that discipline is really, really hard. It's easy to say, it's harder to do, but
absolutely,
when you've got a good group of friends, community doing that alongside you, presumably that makes it a little bit easier.
It does, and I think that's also one of the things about a lot of these religious festivals. When you break the fast, you break them with family and friends. So there's a community sense in it. So you have that community building.
Yeah.
It's also really important.
Yeah. And you said that you don't really mind what people do, but one of the other questions that we had from members was around, your thoughts on these different diets. And so we've seen, for example, the keto diet, there's a protein diets, and the claim that they can reverse, for example, type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Okay. So let me say a little bit about diabetes, because here in Newcastle University, we've done a lot on diabetes. Yes. And as you know, Lynn, our colleague Roy Taylor has led a big and important study about reversing diabetes. Yeah. And what's been discovered in that study is that for people who have type 2 diabetes, that's the commonest kind of diabetes, if you lose weight, so about 10 or 15 kilograms, a lot of people go into remission. Mm-hmm. So their diabetes goes away. Yeah. And it's been quite remarkable. In that study, which was carried out here in the northeast of England and also in Scotland, about 3/4 of the people who managed to lose a good amount of weight and to keep the weight off for a year were free of their diabetes. And that continued. We followed them up now for 2 years and 5 years. Mm-hmm. And the people who could keep the weight off were still free of diabetes. And they had less of all the other problems that go with diabetes. So losing weight's good. Mm-hmm. So let me come now to those diets, keto diets and carnivore diets, and there are lots of them.
Yes.
And most of them are touted as being something which will help you to lose weight. Mm-hmm. There's actually a lot of similarity between the keto diet and the carnivore diet, because what they do inside your body is they encourage the body to burn fat, because you're not eating enough carbohydrate. Oh, okay. So your body needs energy, you're not consuming enough, and so it starts to burn fat. And of course, for people who are weighing too much, mm-hmm. that can be an advantage. Mm-hmm. So in theory, they could work, mm-hmm. but in practice, they've not been very successful. And the problem has been that it's very hard for people to sustain eating those kind of diets for long enough. Yeah. You can do it for a few days or a week or two, but then it just becomes too difficult. Yeah. And there's also a risk that some of these diets will mean that you're short some nutrients. So they might help you to lose a bit of weight, but you run the risk that you might have some other nutritional deficiencies.
Yeah.
So I would caution about a lot of these diets. They're often promoted by people for the best of intentions, and they will say, this worked for me. And, they might have lost a few kilograms, but it's very difficult for most people to sustain that.
Yeah.
And the risks are not insubstantial. So I'll just be cautious about it. And maybe generally, if it sounds too good to be true.
It usually is.
Exactly.
When it is really interesting that you kind of said that about food and nutrition, because I think that's a bit of a confusion, and that nutrients is really, really important. And again, this term of superfood seems to be everywhere these days. You can't kind of turn on social media or the TV without seeing it. And as a scientist, what's your take on this concept of superfoods? And I guess, are there foods that really deserve that label, and why?
Yeah, great question. And yes, over the years that I've been working in this area, lots of things have become fashionable.
Yeah.
And you'll see lots of scientific papers written about them, and then they'll be all over the social media. They're a superfood. I can remember things like broccoli, blueberries, beetroot, yeah, it's a recent one, olive oil. All of these have been, and there is some scientific basis for it. All of these foods that I've mentioned so far all have important things inside, the nutrients in them that we need and that are good for us. Mm-hmm. But I can't take issue with the business of super, because that gives the impression that maybe these are somehow better than other vegetables or fruits or whatever. Yeah. And I don't think there's much evidence for that. Yeah. If you like blueberries or you like broccoli, enjoy it. Yeah. But if you like something else that's a fruit or a vegetable, probably just as good for you. Yeah.
And Nico, we're quite interested in kind of global trends, and you often see this kind of explosion of interest in kale or quinoa, and you wonder kind of what is behind that kind of sudden explosion in popularity and what drives those trends.
Well, nutrition's an area, the whole food and nutrition area is an area where fashion is really important. Mm-hmm. And people like novelty. They like new things.
Yes.
You don't get bored with what you're eating.
Yeah.
And of course, the influencers out there all want to tell you, this is the latest thing. If you eat this, you'll be like me. And, whatever they are, they'll be a magnificent football player or whatever it is. The problem, I think, is that they're often tied up with commercial promotion of certain products. Mm-hmm. So it'll not be a surprise to people to realize that when something appears on social media, when you go to the supermarket, you can see the same thing being promoted there. Yes. So there's often a tie-up between something which is profitable and something which has been being promoted by some influencers. Doesn't say there's anything wrong with them, but they're not anything very special in my view. Yeah. I mean, kale's a lovely food. I grow kale in my allotment, and I love to eat kale in all kinds of different ways. But I don't think it's any better than Brussels sprouts or any other kind of brassica.
Yeah, and that's a really important message, because it's so easy to kind of be almost overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. Yeah. But that's really, really important. I can see the questions coming through, and thanks to everyone, we will get to those. But we also just wanted to talk to you a little bit about again, in the media and from the science, we see a huge amount of ultra processed food, and therefore misinformation. And kind of, what are the dangers, do you think, of nutrition misinformation, and why do you think we're seeing a bit of a rise in it at the moment?
Okay, so I'll deal with the misinformation first, and then I'll come to the ultra processed foods. So misinformation is not a new thing. This has been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you a story about a gentleman who lived in the south of England, and who very sadly died about 50 years ago. And this chap had got the idea that vitamin A was good for you. And he's quite right. We all need vitamin A. It's one of those essential nutrients. But he got a kind of obsessed with it. So he used to take lots of tablets of vitamin A. And in addition, he used to drink a lot of carrot juice. Now, carrot juice is good for you, but not in the quantities, and he drank 1 gallon a day of carrot juice. Right. And he died of liver cirrhosis. So this was a case where a little bit of information was good, so vitamin A is good for you, but it doesn't mean that having 100 times the amount of vitamin A will be even better. In fact, in this case, it was deadly.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of misinformation where people suddenly discover that something's good for you. Then they think that if you have more of that, it'll be even better.
Yeah.
And there are risks with that.
Yeah.
So misinformation's out there. We've talked a bit about misinformation around whole diets, like keto diet and carnivore diet. And I think that this is something where individuals, and it used to be that it would be stars in Hollywood who'd be on some latest diet, a grapefruit diet, a cabbage diet, or only eat fruit diet, whatever it happened to be. And in the short term, a few days is probably not going to do you any harm, but it's not something to do in the longer term. So why is it becoming more of a problem now? Well, I think it's because, sadly, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a loss of confidence in experts. And there's a lot of people who set themselves up as experts and say, I know better, I have all the answers. And very often it's not based on any kind of science. It's based on things they've heard about or maybe their own personal experience. And often these people have great influence, but sadly, it can be misdirected. And my worry is that often people will be following these individuals because they're interesting people for all kinds of other reasons. But then they give advice on food and nutrition, for which they have no good evidence. And that's where it becomes a problem.
And it is really hard for kind of, members of the public to be able to navigate all that. And again, we had a question on some of the mechanisms for challenging these food untruths, especially around packaging or advertising. And there was something the other day that a voice member was talking to me about caramel. On packaging, and actually when you look, it sounds lovely and delicious caramel. It has that kind of association with it, but when you actually unpack it, it's nothing as you thought, and actually not a great ingredient to see there.
Well, I guess there's two aspects to it. There's things around advertising, and the Advertising Standards Authority are the people who police that nationally. So if you're in the UK and you have a worry that things have been advertised wrongly, then you can go to that Advertising Standards Authority. If it's things to do with food packaging or things that's on the product, then DEFRA, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, they're the people who are responsible for all of that. And again, you can complain to them. Just yesterday, I was at a meeting with colleagues from the Food Standards Agency. And one of the things they worry a lot about there is food being imported, so now bought on the web and coming into the UK, that it would not be allowed to be sold here. So you wouldn't be able to buy it in the shop, but you can buy these things online. And it's very difficult to police that. So they have big concerns about how to manage that, because some of those products are not healthy. And they contain things that we would worry about if you're eating regularly.
All the more reason for people to understand the science and the trusted information, which we're back to. Yeah, absolutely. And we touched on ultra processed food, and it gets a lot of negative press at the moment. And tell us a little bit about your perspective on ultra processed foods and kind of the impact on our health, why it's important, and also what can we do about it.
So the second question is really important, so don't let me forget about that. So ultra processed foods is a concept that was actually developed in Brazil. And a colleague there, Carlos Monteiro, developed this as a way of understanding food processing. It was not initially something to do with nutrition and health. It was all about food processing, to understand the kind of levels of processing food. And the more processed foods become, they move from being unprocessed eventually to be ultra processed. And his idea was that this represented that group of foods that were where the raw materials, the wheat or the beans, the meat, whatever, have been taken apart to its individual bits and then reconstructed and processed into some particular kind of product, often with added flavors and colors and all kinds of things. And very often those products are heavily promoted, heavily advertised, and they're relatively inexpensive. So they're everywhere. And in this country, in the UK, more than 50% of what we eat falls into the ultra-processed food category. 50. And for adolescents, it's around 60%. Okay. Now, does it matter? That's a big question. Well, there'll be actually lots of studies over the last few years looking at populations, not here, not just in the UK, all over the world. And what we see is that the more ultra-processed food that are in people's diets, the poorer their health is. So it's linked with things like risk of cancer, risk of diabetes, heart disease, poor mental health, risk of obesity. All of these things are linked with ultra-processed foods. And some people believe that there's enough evidence now to take action and that we should do something. So the government committee that looks after this kind of area, which is called the Scientific Advisory Committee for Nutrition, they reviewed this whole area quite recently, and they acknowledged that there were all these associations, but they weren't convinced that it was telling us something new about the links between food and health. Because we know that foods are high in saturated fat, high in salt, high in sugar, they're not good for us. They're linked to all of these diseases. So it might just be that these ultra-processed foods is another way of describing foods that have those kind of characteristics. So SACN's view, this government committee's view, was that the evidence wasn't good enough to act. And they felt that we needed more research really to understand whether there's something extra, something we haven't understood. And there might be. And it's really important to acknowledge there might be. So it might be something to do with the things that are added during the processing of the food. So things like emulsifiers, flavors, colorings, all those kind of things. Individually, as far as we know, they're all safe. But in combination, we can't be certain. And there's a bit of a worry around just the sheer amount of that which is now in our food. So that's one thing that we're probably going to do more research on. The second is it something to do with the way in which these foods are promoted? Because they're often heavily advertised, they're everywhere in the supermarket, you can find them in your corner shop and so on. So is it just that we're eating too much of them? So we're back to this business, we should be eating a bit less. And we don't know whether that's the case. I'll tell you about one very interesting experiment that was done by colleagues in the USA. They took a group of people, ordinary people, and they brought them into the hospital and they kept them there for a few weeks. And in the first 2 weeks, they were allowed to eat as much as they liked of one set of foods. And then another couple of weeks, as much as they liked of another set of foods. One set of foods had lots of ultra-processed foods in it, and the other were less processed foods. Now, they were eating as much as they liked, and as far as the participants were concerned, they were just eating normal amounts of food. But they put on weight with the ultra-processed foods, and they didn't put on weight. In fact, they lost some weight with the unprocessed foods. So unconsciously, just being given access to these ultra-processed foods, they ate more and put on weight without them realizing it. So there may be something very subtle going on there. And that needs to be teased out now in bigger studies.
And that's what we hope is coming in order to kind of get the complexity of the evidence, isn't it? Because that's what I think we're after. And you touched on there about kind of, you know, the ultra processed food, and I know there's a lot of work being done around kind of food and nutrition inequalities and how they mirror broader social inequalities. And so, you know, could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So by and large, people who are less advantaged in society and more vulnerable in society have poorer diets. And partly this is because they just don't have the resources to enjoy all the things that people who are better off, who can afford them. And so they pay a penalty in having poorer diets, and their children have poorer diets. And they're then that legacy all throughout the whole of their life. So just recently, we did a very interesting modeling study with some colleagues in the University of Bergen in Norway. And what we want to know was, if people improved their diet, what would it do to their life expectancy? Would it really make any difference to how long they lived?
Yeah.
So we took information from the UK population, and we took the people who had the worst diets, and we calculated what the change in their life expectancy would be if they moved to eat what the government recommends. This is called the Eat Well guidelines. So that's a kind of healthy diet. Not many people achieve that, let me tell you. Even among people who are better off, not many achieve it.
Yeah.
Okay. But if we take people who have the worst diets and they move to what the government recommends, for a 40-year-old person doing that, we predicted that they would gain 10 years of extra life. 10 years, which is amazing. And even for people who eat the average diet, so the average person in the country, they could gain 3 or 4 years of extra life if they improved their diet.
And that's healthy life as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So because it's associated with less of these age-related diseases. So really, really important. So we know that improving people's diets is important, but there's a lot of inequalities. And much of the work in this area at the moment is trying to understand those inequalities. And it's quite difficult work because we know that many people would love to eat healthier diets. But all the constraints in their life mean that it's not possible for them to do it, either because they haven't got enough money, or they haven't got the kitchen equipment, they don't have the skills, they're just too busy dealing with all the stuff that's in their lives. So it's a big challenge for us as researchers and also for governments to work out how to resolve that. But I'm really encouraged that we're moving in that direction now. And because we understand a little bit more about what those constraints are in people's lives, and we have some of the ways of helping them to solve those, and some of them are very simple. So, for example, if we made fruit and vegetables cheaper, people could afford to buy more of them. And one of the big supermarkets is trialing that at the moment. They're making vegetables cheaper in those areas where there are more people who are disadvantaged. And what we're hoping is that that will then encourage people to buy more of those now cheaper vegetables. So it's things like that, rather than telling people what to do. It's changing the environment for people to make it easier for them to do the right thing.
Absolutely. And when there's a cost of living crisis, that's so important. Sure. There's lots of questions come through, and we're going to go to those questions in just a moment. But I just wanted to, a quick question on, you mentioned about the example of the man eating vitamin A.
Yeah, sure.
And we've had a lot of questions on vitamin D supplements, which gets a lot of press. Yes. I've just come back from Asia, where there is a real culture of supplements and very, very popular. So where do you think, is there a place where supplements are truly necessary? And if so, what would you prioritize? Okay, so vitamin D is a very interesting and very unusual nutrient, because most of us get most of the vitamin D through the skin. It's not because we eat it, because sunlight on the skin is the way in which we naturally get most of our vitamin D. So in the summer, it's fine. If you're outside, even for 20 minutes, half an hour a day, you can generate enough vitamin D through your skin. No need to worry about the diet. The problem comes from October through to the end of March, because at that time of the year, the angle of the sunshine and the fact we don't have very much of it means that we can't generate much, if any, vitamin D in our skin. And that's been a well-recognized problem in Britain and all northern countries. And the NHS recommends that during those winter months, people consider taking vitamin D supplements. They don't tell us that we should do it, but we should consider it. Now, what should you think about in taking supplements? Well, I think you should think about the rest of your diet, the things that might give you some vitamin D. So most of the vitamin D in our diet comes from animal foods. So you can get it from red meat. Red meat, oily fish, salmon, sardines, tuna, herrings, all of those rich sources of vitamin D. Liver, if you like it, is a great source of vitamin D. So if you eat those things, then you're probably okay. But if you're a vegetarian or a vegan and they're not on the menu for you,
then maybe you need to think about taking supplements. It'll also depend, of course, whether you're lucky enough to get away to the sunshine in the winter for a skiing holiday in the sun or something like that, and can top up your vitamin D. So vitamin D is it's probably the only nutrient where I think supplements for the general population could be important.
And what about, how does our relationship with food change as we age? I mean, you mentioned that you've been long interested in the relationship between nutrition and healthy aging. And so what's some of the latest research telling us on that?
Okay, so the first thing is that what we eat really matters at every stage of your life course. So you can't give up on healthy eating just because you've reached 50 or 60 or whatever. It matters all the way through the life course. And what we've been learning is that changing your diet, even when you're older, can make a difference. So you and I know, Lynn, that we were involved in a project together called Live Well. And the whole idea of that was that we were developing methods to help people around retirement to improve their lifestyle, eating a healthier diet and being more physically active. And what we've been learning is that people who do that, who use retirement or something like that to make changes in their lives, benefit from that for the rest of their life. So it's never too late to make a difference. And I told you about the modeling study we did with our colleagues in Bergen, University of Bergen. So in that study, we also looked at people changing their diet at age 70. And even at age 70, we could see improvements in their lifespan by making a difference to their eating habits. Yeah,
it's so important. And we're going to go to the questions that have come through the chat now. Thank you to everyone for submitting them. But a final previous question that came through was around, is it possible to, for example, lower cholesterol through dietary changes, and other questions around bone health and osteoporosis. And we're really interested in your views on those.
So first of all, on diet and cholesterol, this is where there's really good news and really strong evidence. And we know that eating less saturated fat is the most important and effective way of lowering your cholesterol. Lots and lots of studies in all different parts of the world and repeatedly show the same thing. So we're really confident that eating less saturated fat can help you to lower your cholesterol. So that's good news and really positive. Bone health is a big issue, particularly after the menopause in women, but also for men as we get older. And having a fall and breaking bones is one of the really bad things that can happen to you as you get older. So building stronger bones matters. And you really build bone earlier in life. So this is a case where look after your bones from when you were a young adult. Don't think about trying to improve your bones when you're already hobbling around on your walking stick. It's much more difficult then. So good bone health starts early in life. And it's partly good nutrition, but it's also being physically active because bones really love the combination of good nutrition and plenty of movement.
And again, that's something that, in all our work, we kind of advocate in terms of that through life health and well-being, that this needs to start early in order to accrue the benefits later on. So absolutely brilliant. So listen, we're going to go to some of the questions now, and thank you so much. I do have some ones that were previously submitted as well, John, so I'm going through those. But great question from Phoebe, and saying, what's your use for the personalized diets and for medicine in general, because we are seeing a lot about that at the moment, that people are increasingly understanding that their genetics is actually a relatively small amount of what influences health and well-being, and actually it's lifestyle and that kind of need to personalize. And a specific example around kind of the microbiome and what science offer. Great question, Phoebe.
Great question. And one that's very close to my heart because we've done quite a lot of work on personalized nutrition. In fact, we ran a big study across 7 European countries where we tested the idea that if we personalize the advice we give people, that it might help them to make bigger changes to their diet. And we did it a bit like a clinical trial. So we had a control group who got the standard advice, and then with the people who got the personalized advice. And what we found was that the people who got the personalized advice really did better. They improved their overall diet and sustained that for 6 months. So it really made a difference. So I think personalization has a lot of good things going for it. It comes back to what I was saying earlier about what worked for one person may not work exactly the same for another person, because each person has their preferences and the things that matter to them.
Yeah.
So what about your genetics and what about your microbiome? Well, we didn't look at the microbiome in that particular study I've just mentioned, but we did look at genetics. So we took samples of people's DNA and we looked at their genetic variants and we tried to match the diets to their DNA. It made no difference.
Oh,
It made no difference. So being personalized was what mattered, but it didn't matter whether we looked at their DNA, whether we looked at things in their blood or whatever. The fact that it was personalized was what mattered. And what I take from this is it's all about people's confidence and motivation to make changes. And I think what the people in our study were confident about was that we were trying to do the best for them as individuals. We were giving them the advice that really would work for them. And they didn't really care what we had measured on them, all these fancy things we can do in the lab. Cost us lots of money, but in the end, they just wanted advice that they could follow.
yeah, and advice that they can trust.
Exactly.
Exactly. No, that's really interesting. And an interesting question from Sarah. As someone who's had an eating disorder and now lives with multiple different kind of gut and bowel conditions, plus type 2 diabetes, often you get very kind of competing issues. And I think it's a great question about, as we get older, we get kind of more complexity, and it's kind of, it's very difficult to kind of know, you know, what to do, what to get involved in.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I can't give individual advice like this to someone or a patient. They need to be able to see their GP. But in general, what I'd recommend is that if people have problems that affect many parts of their health, that they need to see a dietitian who will understand all of that complexity and can advise them as an individual what would work for them. And this is particularly important if someone's, for example, had an eating disorder and so on, because they're not simple things to solve.
Yeah.
And you need to look at people holistically. And I think that's something we're getting better. It used to be that individual branches of medicine would look at a particular area of the body and they would focus maybe on the liver or the brain or whatever. Yeah. But of course, we realize that all of these things are connected and what happens to one matters to another. Yeah. So that holistic view of people, I think, is the way forward.
Absolutely, and knee bones connected, isn't it, and everything.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Absolutely, and again, picking up on your previous point about diabetes.
Yes.
You know, the process of eating healthier food led to the result of losing weight.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the weight loss. You know, you can lose weight, as you said, in many different ways, but it's also about what you're eating and the type of foods that you're eating, which matters.
It absolutely is, and I should just tell you a little bit more about that study, the direct study that Roy Taylor and colleagues ran. So it ran in 2 phases, this study. The first bit was about losing the weight.
Yeah.
And people really just had to grit their teeth and, you know, get through that.
Yeah.
It was about 12 weeks to get through it.
Yeah.
And most of them actually found that not too bad.
Yeah.
The difficult bit was when they went back on to their normal foods. And what we were trying to do at that stage, we moved into the second phase, was to help them to have a better pattern, which they could stick with then in the long term. And that's where they really needed a lot of help.
Yeah.
Because all those temptations come back, you know, the chocolate bar,
we're all human. We're all human.
Of course. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's, you know, that kind of changing habits and behavior. And it's great to see so much innovation coming through now that really helps people with that personalized journey, isn't it? And that's where technology and so much can help so much.
It can, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question about, you know, a lot of the work that we know that we need to do in healthy aging is around prevention. We've long fixed problems, but we need to get ahead of the curve. And, you know, in terms of preventing things like kidney stones and stuff that may be associated with diet in some way, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the good thing is that the government has also recognized that prevention matters. I think they're driven with the idea this might save money, and it probably will save money. But I think it's going to be good for us as a population if we focus on stopping the problems rather than trying to fix them once we have them.
Yes.
So that re-emphasis on prevention, and that prevention needs to be lifelong. So it starts in the womb. It starts with looking after pregnant women so they can look after their babies well, and so on. and follow all the way through the life course. And one of the unfortunate things in this country, which we've seen over the last generation, is that children, even from very young ages, are being too heavy. And so they're carrying that legacy of too much weight into the rest of their life. And we've seen from our own studies that they also carry those behaviors from childhood through into adulthood. So it's a whole change in the way in which we organize society to enable people to develop better habits and to continue that all through the life. Technology can help. We can have things on our phones that just, little nudges to do this or do that, or to help us in some ways. I think industry has a lot to do to make the healthy choice the easy choice. I think at the moment the unhealthy choice is the easy choice. So there's a lot of innovation to do there.
Absolutely, and we will come back to kind of that kind of focus on innovation towards the end. But again, you mentioned about some of the committees that you were on, and it's kind of, it plays kind of in terms of who is the experts here. And I think there's a question around, there are massive food industry kind of vested interests, etc. In the USA, it's different to the UK, where you've got a self-certified system to kind of introduce new processed kind of ingredients into the food chain. But who are the experts? How do we know what's coming through? And then, as you said, there's a lot of uncertainties into what's the impact on people's health. So that's a great question from Vicky.
Vicky, so let me just
Yvonne, sorry.
Yvonne, let me just tell you a little bit about what happens in the UK. In the UK, we have a committee which is run by the Food Standards Agency, and their job is to monitor anything new that's coming into the food chain. So if it's a new ingredient, a new process, whatever it happens to be, and to see that it's safe, and it wouldn't be allowed to be sold unless it was safe. So we have that reassurance. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the unanswered questions, and one of the things which still needs a lot of research, is about the combinations of things. So each individual food additive might be fine, but if you've got 20 or 30 of those in a food, is it still fine? We don't know that, because the way in which we've looked at safety has looked at them one by one. So although I think the system in general is good, there are still some areas where it needs to improve.
There's a question, John, around food intolerances, which is quite an interesting one as well. I mean, it's, in terms of lots of different intolerances, and it is increasingly, there's more common allergens and so on. And, what are your thoughts on that in terms of how we address that?
You're absolutely right. And it seems to be allergies and intolerances, not just to things in food, but also things generally that we come up against in our environment. So we're becoming somehow more sensitized to these things. So it looks as if in some ways our immune system has not adapted to our modern way of living. And there's lots of research going on at the moment to try and understand what it is about our immune system. And it might come back to the microbiome. It might come back to the way in which our microbiome is being changed, because it is closely connected to our immune system. Now, still lots to be sorted out, but there's that complexity about what we eat, what that does to our microbiome, and then how that helps our immune system or hinders our immune system to deal with all of these things.
And again, we are very interested in almost a human exposome in terms of, how we get that interface between our own personal health and well-being and our environment. And that's an area that we're just starting the journey, really, aren't we?
We are, but it's an area where the kind of tools and technologies that scientists have are getting better and better. So lots of things around data, and we're in a building where we have a big data institute. So that kind of thing is really going to be important for us in the future. So taking all of this complex information and making sense of it.
Absolutely. I think that's what, in essence, these are what these great questions are about, because there's a great question here in terms of, at a granny level, what's the best breakfast to eat to stay full and satisfied, and then to reduce the glucose spikes? Because we all know that if you get hungry at 11 o'clock, that's when you reach for a snack, etc.
Yeah.
So, you know, and another question which is kind of linked to that, in terms of, you know, where do you get advice in terms of, does anyone publish information on food where you can get this kind of advice and guidance, especially around portions?
So let me deal with the advice bit of it first of all. Yes, there are some trusted sources of good advice, and we put together a little pack for people, and we'll make it available after this. And there are 5 or 6 organizations that provide really sensible and evidence-based advice. So when you get those after the webinar, do have a look at that. In relation to breakfast and things like this, you know, glucose lows that people talk about, and you know, they're desperate for a chalky biscuit or something. In general, what the research is telling us is if you have a wholemeal cereal breakfast, that could be brown toast, it could be wholemeals, you know, breakfast cereals with some fruit, usually that helps people through the rest of the morning because it's digested more slowly. And you don't have these big spikes and big dips that you get if either you don't have breakfast or you have something terribly sweet. So it's a bit boring in a way, because it's the sort of things your granny might have told you, but it's really good advice.
It's really good advice. Well, sometimes it's the most established advice that is the best sort of thing. And I mean, there's a great question here in terms of, obviously, as a National Innovation Centre for Ageing, we're interested in ageing well. And, you know, the question is around, should we avoid foods with more than 5 ingredients, given you were saying about, you know, the complexity that is, and, you know, if they contain chemicals and additives, you know, that you wouldn't normally use in your own cooking, or is it better to focus on what those ingredients actually are?
Okay, so this is very complex, and it's back to the ultra-processed food story. And some of those ultra-processed foods have lots and lots of ingredients. If you look on the pack, you'll see dozens sometimes of ingredients. It doesn't mean to say that they're better or worse than the ones that have a shorter list. So I don't think the number of ingredients is what matters. It's also very difficult if you're a busy person or you have, you know, a lot of things going on with your family and so on, and you're having to rely on things that are already pre-prepared, that are ready to eat or ready to heat. They can be very convenient, very easy, tasty, and so on. So I think we need to avoid saying to people that you should now start cooking everything from scratch, because it's simply not practical for a lot of people. So I think I want to get away from putting all the onus on the individual. I think this needs to go back to the food manufacturers, the food retailers, to try and make it easier for people to choose healthier things.
And nudge those healthy habits and behaviours.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And there's a great question in terms of, do vegans live less long or live longer?
Good question. So it's actually quite difficult to know for vegans specifically, because there's not been enough research done on vegans, but there's been a lot of work done on vegans and vegetarians as a group. So people who don't eat meat. And in many studies, those people have healthier later lives. So they have less of some of those terrible diseases that people end up with, less cancer, less likely of heart disease, and so on. So it does look as if eating less meat might be healthier. And in fact, that's the general advice now in the UK, to restrict the amount of red meat that people consume. Not to cut it out altogether, but just to eat less of it, and to eat more fruits and vegetables and so on, whole grain foods, pulses and so on, the things that are healthier. So it's again about balance. One of the problems, I think, for research in the area about does vegan, do they do better or do worse, is that actually, apart from the fact that they don't eat meat or other animal products, they are quite diverse. And some may have quite healthy habits and some not so healthy habits. So when you talk about people who are vegetarian or vegan, it's not just about diet. It's also about all the other things that they do in their lives. Are they smokers? Are they physically active? You know, there's a lot of things that make these difficult to answer with a simple answer.
So we need to embrace the complexity, etc. There's some really great questions, and they are keeping on coming. So even if we can't get through them all, we will faithfully capture them all and get back at another point. But questions around kind of oils and rapeseed oil and vegetable oils, and that's a really great question, because that's again confusing in terms of which oil is better. You have the virgin olive oil and so on.
Okay, so I mentioned olive oil earlier because it was sometimes a superfood.
Yeah.
And it was thought of as superfood because it was seen to be part of the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
And Mediterranean diets are associated with all kinds of health benefits. And I think they are. I think the evidence is pretty strong that if you have a more Mediterranean-like diet, you'll live longer and you have a healthier old age. But it doesn't mean to say that only a Mediterranean diet can achieve that.
Yeah.
Because what's, I think, significant about a Mediterranean diet is that it's a diet rich in plant-based foods. So it's got lots of fruits, vegetables, pulses, nuts, seeds, and so on. Hardly any red or processed meat, and only a small amount of dairy products. So it's largely a plant-based diet. And it's not, at that level, too different from the traditional Japanese diet, which is also associated with really good
healthy
aging.
Long lives.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So it's about those patterns. It's not about something magical. So let me come back to the oils. So does the type of oil matter? And when we've been doing work on the Mediterranean diet, we've been told by people in the public, that we're doing work with the public, that olive oil is far too expensive. And it is expensive, especially if you buy extra virgin.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate because of agricultural problems in the Mediterranean area. It's really difficult for them. But I don't think there's anything magical about olive oil. Rapeseed oil, which we grow here, and which hasn't had much of a press, it's used to make margarine and all kinds of stuff, actually is not very different from olive oil in terms of the type of fat which is in it. It can often be much, much cheaper. So if you like it, why not?
And again, that's one of the areas that, as you know, remember, the public doesn't necessarily know. So that's really, really, really helpful. I want to just ask you, because we're aware of time, but from your position, we're about healthy aging, and we've talked a lot about kind of that need for proper nourishment and good habits across the life course. But from your perspective as a nutrition expert, you know, we're at the National Innovation Centre for Aging.
Yes.
What's the most game-changing innovation do you think that we need right now? Is it in food technology? Is it in the delivery systems? Is it in kind of community support? You know, what innovation do we need to really take that step change to transform lives?
I don't think there's one step. I think there's lots of things that we can do. And actually, these are very exciting from industry's point of view, and also for young people in terms of potential new opportunities for jobs and so on. So I think there's a lot we can do around what's sometimes called reformulation of foods. So when the foods are being manufactured by the big manufacturers, Nestle's and Unilever's and so on, they can make all kinds of changes to the way in which they do their processes. And those can really make a difference to the health of the food then we consume. And I think there's a huge amount of innovation that can come in at that level for food technologists and so on to make healthier foods that we really still love to eat.
Yes.
Which are much better for us.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
The second thing, I think there's a lot that can be done on the marketing side. So here's a lot of things that we can do around social media and around technologies for supporting behavior change. So lots of things here where AI could do a lot to help, particularly around personalizing advice to people. So we've had lots of great questions from people on the webinar. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
All of those questions then could be used to tailor advice to people.
Because the communication of this is just so important.
Yeah, exactly.
And, absolutely.
So lots of opportunities for improvement.
Great. And I think, you know, another area that I guess in terms of communication is that we have had some questions around the new generation of weight loss drugs, which is making a lot of headlines at the moment. And as a nutrition expert, I guess kind of what interests you or perhaps concerns you about these developments?
Okay. So first of all, it's been fantastic. The achievements of these drugs have been outstanding. So They enable people to lose weight and to keep the weight off in ways that nothing before it has allowed. Most of the research has been done with people who are really very heavy. So the whole idea was the people who are in the most need of losing weight, and it works very, very well. One of my worries about it is that because it works well in those people, people who need to lose a little bit of weight would think, well, I could use that rather than changing my behavior. I can just use this magical drug and that will solve the problem. I think there's two issues with that. The first is that these drugs are expensive, and for many people, they're just out of reach. And you can't be prescribed them in this country unless you have these conditions that require them. So I think there's an issue about inequalities there, that it might be that the richer people can afford them, and those people who maybe need them more can't afford them.
And it's still back to habits and behaviours. And
exactly.
What makes you the most optimistic then about the future of nutrition and nutrition science?
Well, I come back to what I said at the beginning, that we now know it pervades every aspect of health. So that means that it matters to everybody. So across the whole of the healthcare professions, we're all interested in helping people to eat better. So that means that we can do more, whether it's for your bad knees or protecting your brain or whatever it happens to be. So I'm very optimistic that at a kind of professional level, there's so much more interest in nutrition that we can make things happen. The other thing I think which is really important is that we now understand much more about the mechanisms, how it happens, what it is that happens inside your body, inside individual cells, that makes a difference. And there's been dramatic improvements at that level over the last 20 or 30 years. And I can see that only taking off.
It's an incredibly exciting time. And again, kind of, if you think about what we've learned so much over the last 20 years, as we look forward with AI, with innovation, with technology, there's that opportunity to kind of really power our knowledge about innovation. John, I think you're going to have to come back several times because we've got more questions and we've got, even more questions from talking to you. So I just want to thank you so much on behalf of the Voice and Nika team, and also, the wider Voice members, for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've had so many questions, and they vary from everything from kind of bone density through to kind of, everything around the 5 fruit and veg a day. So we've got so much more that we need to answer. But, thanks for your incredible expertise and wisdom on all aspects of healthy aging. I've found it so interesting, and I know everybody else has too. So we're out of time today. Thank you so much for joining and listening. We do have a link for you to join Voice if you're new members. Thank you to those who are our existing members. This is really our chance to kind of learn about the latest innovation, science and technology, to really be part of amplifying people's voice to influence the future. So thank you for joining Voice Explores today. Massive thank you to John. Thank you for your questions. And we very much look forward to taking on Voice Explores for many other issues that concern us about healthy aging in the future. So look forward to you joining again very soon.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been great. I enjoyed all your questions. And Lynne, thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you, John. Amazing.